Welcome to another edition of Meet the Researcher. Today we're speaking to Professor Derk Loorbach, Professor of Socio-economic Transitions and Director of DRIFT, which is the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions at Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands. We're talking to him today about his book, Finance in Transition, which is going to be published shortly. So we're going to first start with the first section of the conversation today to learn a little bit more about you, to meet the researcher. So, Derk, if you could just tell me a little bit more about just who you are.
Yeah, you already introduced my formal side. So on the personal side, I'm a father of 3 children. I play bass guitar in a band. But maybe more relevant is that my background is really hybrid. So a bit of activism, a bit of policy scholarship, but also I do a lot of consulting and outreach towards media or to the general public. So what we do here at DRIFT is really work together with a lot of different academics that are very engaged and committed to sustainability, on trying to understand why it's so difficult to make a transformative change, and experiment with ways to accelerate sustainability transitions. I don't know if that helps. I'm born in Rotterdam, where I also work, which is a port city in the Netherlands, which is a great city because it has all the problems that we also face on a global level. So we're below sea level. We're an immigration city with an industrial past, with a very fossil-based port that is under pressure. We're a very car-based city that we try to shift towards a cycling city. It's a very concrete city, a lot of poverty and social health issues. So for an action researcher on sustainability transitions, it's the ideal laboratory.
No, that's really exciting, and I would say, having visited Rotterdam several times myself, it's also a very dynamic city. It's also this center of arts and culture. It's a really an exciting place to be. But I'm really interested in what you said about being kind of you're a hybrid in a way that you're a researcher, but you're also part activist, and you're interested in application. And I'm curious because the most of your focus, your professional and academic focus is on transitions. Can you just tell me a little bit more about how you became interested in this topic, and as you said, how it connected to all these other activities that you've been undertaking?
Well, already I would say maybe in my early years when I was young, I was already fascinated by new technologies and energy transition. Long before we called it energy transition, but it really started in the 1990s when I went to university, and a lot was going on in the world. On the one hand, people felt it was the end of history in terms of democracy had won, the Cold War was over, we had globalization, economic growth, everything was fine. And on the other hand, you have a lot of academics that started to question this narrative and started to think, well, we have these global issues emerging. We have inequality. We have it was called the G8, like the big rich countries that decided the fate of the world. So there were a lot of protests emerging, and I was studying something that was called culture and science. It was a combination of philosophy, social science, economy, history, so a lot of different disciplines together, to study social issues. And at the same time, I was participating in all sorts of social movements. There were protests against this G8. There was a lot going on in terms of, is this really the end of history, or is this just a temporary pause before we have to make a completely new, enter a new era of large-scale social change. And then I had the luck basically to come into a university institute at the University of Maastricht, where a group of researchers, historians, complex system theory people, governance people, just come up with the idea of applying the concept of transitions to sustainable development. And I was asked, fresh out of university, we have this idea that sustainable development, as we mostly apply it in policy and in markets, is mainly making existing systems more efficient or less bad. And we want systems change. So can you start to think about governance for systems change, which they call transition management? It's a very awkward term. But that was basically a stroke of luck, because it was the starting point for me also to bring a lot of the experience I had in building social movement, activism, but also thinking deeply about systemic change and transformative change, as I had learned in my university. It's around in a lot of different disciplines. And to bring that together to really create a new theory or new experimental ways to accelerate sustainability transitions. And I can explain a bit later, a bit more about what those are, but in essence, it's about questioning everything and trying to create space for the new things that are now marginalized or alternative or weak or suppressed, that in a way challenge the norm, to empower those alternatives. And that's as a researcher, you can play a lot of different roles to help question the norm and to empower the alternatives that also do that.
That's really fascinating. I guess I have a follow-up question to this in terms of sort of how you've described Rotterdam as being a great kind of microcosm that represents all of these challenges that you could turn in, that are effectively, ripe for the transition experiment or for analysis from a transition approach. But I think something that's unique in a Dutch context is that you have a policy environment that is extremely responsive to these kinds of challenges. And, for example, the Dutch diamond model, the whole idea around poldering. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about your experience in trying to export or use these concepts outside of the Dutch context.
Well, I would say that's a very common misconception that the Dutch governance model is so good for transitions. Actually, it's very much working against it. So the polder model you refer to, it's a typical name they give to the Dutch tradition of consensus-based politics, where the big organizations from society come together to basically discuss progress based on a consensus model. In transition jargon, we call this the regime. Not necessarily an evil regime like a dictator. It could be a dictator, but it's more commonly used to describe business as usual. So the existing institutions and routines and values that are present in a social system, and often we apply it to an energy system or a mobility system or the food system or a region like Rotterdam, but you can also apply it to the governance system. And the regime in the Netherlands is the polder model, which is really based on creating stability and incremental progress based on the existing organizations and institutions and sectors. A transition is, in essence, a regime change. So it's the change from one regime, which is very dynamic and all sorts of things are happening. We're innovating all the time and making things more efficient, but it's relatively stable in one context or situation. A transition is a process where over a period of 1 or 2 or 3 decades, this regime shifts to a new state. And this is always a very disruptive, chaotic, and shockwise process. So what we see now is, for example, in the Netherlands, all these sustainability challenges. For decades already, that we are aware of climate change, of the effect of emissions. In the Netherlands, is very good in food, in our agricultural production, but it's very bad for our environment and for the farmers. And this is known for decades. But through the polder model, we don't really transform this system to something that could be really nature positive or sustainable, but we try to keep it in place and make it less bad and make all sorts of compromises, with the effect that we end up making the problems worse and worse and worse. So if you look at the environmental performance of the Netherlands, we're doing quite poorly. And the interesting thing, this is partly also why transition management emerged as a way to start thinking not about organizations and existing power positions, but to start thinking about people that are aware of the unsustainability of the regime, and to connect these to create a new kind of narrative, a new kind of structures, networks, and power dynamics. My colleague Flora Vlino calls it transformative power, to ultimately become the new regime or change the existing regime. And this logic, how we apply it is different in every context. I teach, for example, in Suriname. We do projects in sub-Saharan Africa in informal settlements. We do projects in all sorts of different sectors, from the fashion industry to the accountants to the port here in Rotterdam to homeless youth. Whatever complex, persistent problem we encounter, you can apply this frame of transitions to start to understand, okay, where are the patterns of persistent unsustainability, what is holding it in place, and where are people coming up with alternatives that are really potentially transformative but are not connected or not visible or not organized enough. And this is sort of the transition logic, which is also a bit of a, let's say, a political logic of using the tools and position you have as a researcher, to challenge what most people feel is normal or is just there, to challenge that and to help to empower counter narratives or counter movements or alternative practices or new social entrepreneurship or alternative lifestyles, whatever is fundamentally more sustainable than what we have now.
That's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to ask a follow-up question, which is probably the obvious question you get asked quite a bit, but is, we're in probably in recent history in one of the most disruptive periods in many people's living memory through COVID. How does this help? I'm thinking more about the transformation, the active transformation agenda, not necessarily the research from the research standpoint.
Well, it's also, as a researcher, is a fascinating time. So COVID is typically what we call an expected surprise. So if something is unsustainable, and for us, our global economy based on fossil fuels, on linear ways to use, produce and consume resources, and the extractive model where we extract value from other communities, and I'm talking now about the developed world, and nature, and create value for a very limited amount of people, economic value, that is something that is fundamentally unsustainable. So from a transitions point of view, you can expect that there will be crises or disruptions or shocks that will push this economic regime out of its equilibrium. But what happens then is that it doesn't work like a tipping point, as they call it in ecology, where you pass a threshold and then suddenly everything flips to a different state, because we are people and there's power. So if you read the shock doctrine from Naomi Klein, the famous book, she talks a lot about how existing or industries or powerful people and positions can use a crisis to make the position even stronger. So the rich become richer through COVID and the poor become poorer. At the same time, it's such a massive wake-up call that what we see is all these marginalized or alternative or not so visible people that were in communities, in social enterprises, but also in policy offices already for longer, trying to think about transformative change and trying to develop alternatives, new ways to new food systems, alternative mobility, renewables, alternative finance, local economies. All these alternatives start to get a big boost. They get more interest from people take them more seriously, they start to connect more, they get more support from policy. So what I see is that it's really accelerating this political and power struggle of a regime shift. And we see at the same time governments and industries trying to re-stabilize and use a lot of public money to recover the old economy. But the sort of emerging sustainability transitions are also gaining strength. And they are inevitably going to win at some point. His history tells us it needs to become worse or it needs to destabilize first before this can happen. So it's also quite concerning, obviously, that it's still not clear enough to most of the people that we need to transition to a nature positive economy, as we call it now. And that implies phasing out fossil and linear and extractive economic models. And it also means ending the illusion of green growth and sustainable development as we've tried it for decades.
Thank you. Before moving, because we've been speaking, we're in the section about meeting the researcher. But we've spoken a lot about the concepts that you work with in this part of our conversation. I think before moving on to discuss your book, Finance and Transition, more specifically, I'm wondering if you could just share something with us that we might find surprising. You know, you've spoken with a lot of passion about the environment and clearly, I think about the passion around these transitions, around these topics. But maybe there's something else that we don't know about you and the public doesn't know about you.
Well, you don't know what you don't know, but what do you want to know?
Let's about your band history, for example. Let's hear a little bit more about that.
Well, it's now more a hobby project. It started out during my university, actually. So I'm the only one left of this formation because I also moved and other people moved. But during the 90s, we got inspired by bands like the Queens of the Stone Age. Maybe some people know it. So it's more like a rock-oriented band. And at that time, we had especially our singer was really fanatic, and he thought we could make it. So we actually did a lot of gigs, but obviously we didn't make it because nobody else took that seriously. So now every Wednesday we still practice, and it's a great way to something and you're completely focused on making music together. It's completely pointless because we sometimes are asked to perform, but we'd rather not because that involves a lot of hassle and effort, and we all have jobs. So it's really a music therapy also, and it's fun to do. Yeah, and I think that's also like sports as well. I do running, but my music it's a way to distract yourself completely from saving the world, which is also a serious thing that can occupy your mind most of the day. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm a keen runner myself, and I actually find the time to spend on running is it also helps. It doesn't not always just distract, but it can also help. You've discussed are really complex problems, and running somehow helps you work out or identify, the specific problems that can be, where solutions can be found. So.
Yeah, and I feel that I lead here. Our group is like 40 people, and a lot of the young academics. They do everything. They take everything so seriously, and that's also one thing I learned during my university years. Partying a lot. The Netherlands also has a liberal drug culture. I won't recommend it to anybody, but for me, sort of having music, organizing parties, going out, putting things in perspective is really important, because before you know it, you really think you are needed to save the world. So it's sometimes quite difficult, but you need to find a balance between taking it extremely seriously and laughing at it at the same time, because it's so trivial. And then also music helps it, and running and.
Absolutely, I think that's a great piece of advice to offer to young professionals and young researchers. We're going to move to the second part of our discussion, and to meet the research specifically and your book, Finance in Transition. We've spoken in getting to know you. We've learned a lot about what the transitions approach is, and this is as being a broad approach that covers any kinds of systems change. But I'm wondering if you could just maybe tell us a little bit more about sort of the key concepts and key frameworks that are used to frame this approach.
And specifically about the book or not?
In terms of the book, but also more broadly, because I think this, as you've discussed before, it's not a term that's applied specifically to finance. It covers a whole broad range of transitions in the economy.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the word transition is it's used in a lot of different scientific disciplines, and it refers to this specific pattern of change in complex adaptive systems. So you can find it in developmental psychology, or in ecology, or in environmental evolutionary biology, or in social change theory. We apply it to sectors of the economy and spatial regions, where we say, okay, in a social context, we organize societal functions in a particular way, where what we call the regime is the dominant discourse and values, dominant structures like the technologies, the institutions, the rules and regulations, and the dominant practices. So in any complex social system, we can start to ask, what is the dominant regime? And there's a lot of different academic theories behind it, but that is the starting point. It's also a way to start questioning business as usual, because this idea of a regime is the context within which we all operate, basically, and try to improve things. But the transition logic is you need to zoom out. You need to ask, what's the origin of this regime? Where did it come from? And then a transition is basically the process where this regime, where people try to make things better, it gets locked in, as we call it. So we improve and improve and improve, but the diversity decreases and it becomes more and more rigid. but the context changes, so society around it changes and puts pressure on actors within the regime to make it even better. And that creates all sorts of tensions and frictions. And then there's individuals that just start to do something completely different. They come up with a new technology, new business model, etc. So this perspective is a way to question our path dependencies or what we are stuck in, and to see, okay, what's going on. And then the publication, I came in contact with a colleague of mine, Professor Derk Loorbach. He's professor of sustainable finance. And Willem Schramade, he formerly led a €1 billion investment fund. So he's an investment banker, but he turned green, and then he started to become interested in the role of finance for sustainability. And Derk Loorbach, this professor, he worked for the government, for the finance ministry and the finance sector. And then at some point in South Africa, he had a sabbatical, and it's very difficult, but then he saw the light, he connected to nature, and he saw the error of his ways, and then he became involved in this topic. And then he invited me to write a publication on finance for sustainability transitions. So he was thinking, okay, we have energy transition, but it costs a lot of money. So how do we get the money to finance this transition? And through having conversations, I helped him to think about the transition in finance, in terms of questioning this logic of investment that is so dominant in the finance system. So the energy transition, for me, is because the fossil energy system is creating a lot of negative effects. So it pollutes the environment, it's subsidized with public money, and it is extractive in the sense that all the social and environmental costs are socialized, and all the benefits are going to shareholders. So we try to come up with new technologies and new alternatives that work completely differently than fossil fuels. So fossil fuels is like you build a power plant and then you make money for 30 years. With a windmill or a solar panel, you build it, you sell it, and then you make energy for 30, 40 years. So the whole logic of investment and finance is different. But behind it is also the storyline that the way the finance system now works, the finance regime, it's based on extraction and on not accounting for all the costs and benefits, and that is unsustainable. So then we started to look at, okay, how sustainable is the way we now think about finance, and how the rich get richer, and how we destroy nature, because ultimately it will mean all these fossil and extractive industries will have to go, basically. They don't have a long-term future. So the industries that now make money for the finance system and that the finance sector finances are unsustainable, literally. So they don't have a long-term future, which means that we need a completely different finance logic, so a different finance regime. And then we started to see, to look at, okay, is this already emerging? And yes, it is. We see new digital disruptions in finance. We see new social economies. We see new accounting measures like the capitals accounting approach. We see new visions for a future of finance, like a nature positive economy, for example. So the book in the end is also for me sort of a nice transition experiment, because I'm no finance expert, but they are. But applying then the finance or this transition perspective together with someone that is an expert on finance, it creates a completely new narrative. And the book writing process we did was we organized a couple of online Zoom sessions with people from their network, so the ministry, banking sector, the finance transformers, which created already a network of people that are now talking about the transition in the finance sector. So I'm really proud of this book. It's a nice book. It's going to be online and open access, but I'm perhaps even happier with the mindset transition that took place in the writing team, but hopefully also that we can bring into the finance sector itself, that they get out of thinking about, okay, we need to do the current finance better, to we are part of actually a transition towards a completely new finance future. So in the end of the book, we try to give a lot of more practical recommendations on how you can do that. That we call transition management, which is basically the trick I just explained very quickly. So what we did in the book is what we do in practice. As a researcher, we come into a context where we meet people that have the actual knowledge on the context, whether it's a neighborhood or a sector or an organization, but we come with our transition perspective and our instruments as researchers, and then we combine that into a new narrative and a new idea and new interventions that hopefully help accelerate desired transition.
Thank you. It's interesting. I had a number of questions, like follow-up questions to ask you around the book, but I think in your summary of describing the entire process, you've answered many of them. But I think the one thing I'm going to pick up on is just what you had said about that this is sort of your first experience applying these frameworks to the financial services sector, and interestingly the research collaboration was with experts in the financial services industry, which to some degree had some knowledge of the transitions approach. I'm wondering if you could share with me a little bit more about the challenges and greatest learnings of working together in a group like that.
Well, to me, it's always exciting because we limit our collaborations to people that are already intrinsically motivated or curious or open to discover the transitions perspective. But in just behind it, you always find people that might think it's interesting, but are still quite stuck in the old ways. So if we connect to the first group, it's always exciting because it also makes you rethink your own assumptions or how you apply things or how you see things. But you want to get to the other groups. To make them or to have them start the process of rethinking, what am I doing? Am I part of this regime trying to, well, make things less bad, or am I a part of a desired transition? And you always discover that it's inherently more complex and more connected and persistent than you thought. So it's easy as an outside position to have like a stereotypical assumptions, or you just think everything needs to change, or all the banks just need to do things differently. But when you go in, you understand there's people there, there's logics, there's also pros and cons to everything. So that's it in a way also makes you more modern. But the connection to people on the inside of these regimes that are feeling the same kind of urgency, but also the sense of potential, that creates always excitement and inspiration.
And just to follow up on this, I think the way that you've also described the book is in terms of the collaboration and the engagement with different participants in the financial sector, with regulators and legislators. if in your best world scenario, what would you say would be the concrete impact of this book, or what would you want any reader to take away from it?
Well, we end with a number of concrete recommendations for how financial organizations, for example, should engage with the transition. We call it transition arena, but basically go through this kind of a transition dialogue internally. You need to have that facilitated by transition researchers, but that helps to accelerate an internal transition that relates to their internal accounting model. The kind of capacities or competences they recruit people for, how they are organized, what they value, what they invest in. So that's the second big part is I'm part of the university, and in our educational system, we still educate finance people, but also in economy and in business schools with the traditional idea of profit maximization, of increased efficiency, of green growth, and all those kind of values and models and assumptions that are behind it are not valid anymore. So we still educate people to sustain an economic model that is unsustainable. So we also need to change the education. And this book is not going to change that all, but I hope it creates or offers a different kind of starting point and narrative for the people that are already doing this kind of stuff, because we didn't really invent it. It's just combining it and giving it a nice package, feel empowered, but that also we can start engaging on a more senior policy or decision-making level with this argument that we can say, okay, you're still part of sustaining the old system. It's investing in a bankrupt model or in a model without a future, so you might end up losing a lot of money, and then you also have all these ecological costs to add. So why don't you start investing more in a nature positive finance transition? So it creates an academic argument at a strategic level to engage with the regime, and it offers tools and arguments for empowerment of the emerging transition.
It's exciting to hear what you said about the education system. I think that's something, again, this project intends to help change, and it's been since working at the PRI as well has been a strong focus of the academic network there is around creating more, especially more interdisciplinary education system, and business education system as well. So that's really exciting. We're running out of time, so I'm going to close to just ask you with some parting questions around the outlook for our next generation of professionals in research. And I guess, you've touched on it a lot, but maybe if you could say a few words about the key challenges that the next generation faces in terms of these addressing these transitions, and your advice to them in terms of the practical steps that they could take. As you said, we're at a turning point, but it's not really certain which direction that turning point is going to take right now. So what tools would you tell them to develop to empower themselves?
Well, I have different types of tips or comments. One I already touched upon, which is on a personal level: stay sane, try to enjoy life, and not take it too seriously in terms of feeling personally responsible for the existential problems that we are facing, basically. So, enjoy yourself also. Then the second thing is in terms of mindset. To me, a transition mindset is that you are reflexive and are able to put things in perspective, but are also engaged and activist and intrinsically motivated. So try to find your own motivation what drives you, and try to see yourself as a whole person. So it's mostly academics, I feel that are listening in. It's a role you take, but you're also a person. You're a friend, you're a family person, you're a consumer, you vote, you are a volunteer. So in all these roles, you are part of this bigger global transition that we are in the midst of. And in all these roles, you can contribute to the kind of issues that you find relevant through all sorts of actions. So see your research as a part of a bigger thing. And I know some people, they work in one field and then they start to do a PhD in another field. I always advise against that, because then it's not connected. And you do research, as something that's external, that you do on the side as a hobby maybe, and then it becomes really hard. So try to connect somehow on a motivational level what you are doing. And then the third comment I want to make is we are also in a transition in science and in the academic world. So I'm in the social sciences. A lot of the social sciences have moved to behave like natural sciences. They want to be descriptive and objective and neutral. Forget this whole idea. So if we talked about economics and finance and business administration, they are not neutral. They act like they are neutral, but it's a political strategy to some extent. Because look at what's happening in the world. It's partly produced through business administration, through public administration, through innovation studies, through economics. And as long as these disciplines are not reflexive enough to acknowledge their part in this problem, they are closet normative. And what I want to say with this is that more and more academics are becoming openly normative when it comes to the problems they want to address. So activist in science doesn't mean you have the solution. Nobody has a solution and the future is uncertain. But we have all the science that points at the existential problems that there are. So be very confident and outspoken about these persistent problems and unsustainability, and then engage in a much more outward, entrepreneurial way with the things that you feel are better, are promising, are potentially transformative. And by embracing those and bringing your research skills and your different roles to those communities, businesses, empirical context where alternatives are happening, you add most value, you get new knowledge, you become relevant as a researcher, but you also become a happy person, like me.
Derk Loorbach, thank you so much. This was a very inspiring conversation for me, and I hope for everybody listening in. Thank you so much for your time, Derk.
You're welcome.